The hangar felt like a world apart, a place where time stood still and the silence became an unbearable weight. The metal walls, covered in a thin layer of ice, reflected the dim light that filtered through the small cracks in the structure, creating shadows that moved with the wind outside. The cold was more than a physical sensation. It was an invisible enemy that seeped into her skin, burning every exposed inch and slowly stealing away any remaining heat. The humid air clung to her face, and her breath formed dense clouds that slowly dissipated, as if even her breath itself were moving in slow motion. She was there, isolated, as if punished, with no voice to protest, and no idea how long she would have to endure this solitude. The wind outside whistled, as if trying to penetrate the cracks and invade the interior, making the metal tremble and emit low, long noises like groans of pain. Each sound echoed through the empty space, heightening the feeling that she was not only alone but also forgotten. Her boots sank lightly into the thin layer of snow that had formed on the ground, and each footstep sounded too loud in the dense silence. The punishment wasn't just being locked in there. It was facing the psychological weight of a place that seemed alive, breathing alongside her, watching her every move, as if the hangar were a silent jailer. Sitting on a wooden crate in the corner, she tried to keep herself hunched up to conserve heat. Her hands, covered in worn gloves, no longer felt the rough texture of the fabric, and the cold was beginning to numb her fingers. The hours seemed to stretch, and there was no clock to mark the time. Only the subtle change in the light coming through the half-open door indicated the day was advancing. Outside, gusts of wind brought icicles that hit the structure like tiny needles, a repetitive, almost hypnotic sound, but one that brought no comfort. Sometimes the noise grew louder, and the entire hangar seemed to shudder. At those moments, she imagined the walls would give way, that an avalanche of snow would invade the space and swallow her whole. But nothing happened. It was just the wind, playing at challenging the strength of the metal. The worst part, however, wasn't the cold, nor the sound of the wind, but the feeling that this punishment had a purpose beyond punishment, as if someone wanted her to be there, in that exact spot, waiting for something, or someone, to approach. The smell was another constant reminder of where I was. A mix of rust, old oil, and damp, it seemed to permeate my clothes and skin. The thin air made breathing difficult, and with each deep breath the cold seemed to invade my chest, burning me from within. Every now and then I could hear the crackling of ice in the corners of the hangar, as if the structure were adjusting to the weight of the snow accumulated on the roof. But something was different that night. The crackling was more frequent, drier, as if coming from a specific point rather than from the entire building. She closed her eyes for a few seconds, trying to concentrate and hear better. But the wind again covered any noise, like an invisible blanket muffling all signals. Meanwhile, memories flooded her mind. The moment she'd been placed there, the short, cold words she'd received before the door closed. There was no long explanation, just the order to remain until further notice, and she knew there was no point in insisting. Once a decision was made in that place, there was no turning back. What bothered her most was the expressionless expression on the face of the person who'd placed her there. There was no anger, no contempt, just indifference. It was as if she were just a piece that needed to be removed from the board for a few hours. But why? With each passing minute, the feeling that something was wrong grew. The cold seemed more intense, as if it were coming from within the hangar itself, not just from outside. She rubbed her arms, trying to generate heat, but the frigid air cut off any attempt at warmth. Outside, the wind changed direction, and the sound became higher-pitched, almost like a constant whistling that seeped through the walls. The ice in the cracks seemed to shimmer differently, reflecting the little light that came from outside in bluish and silvery hues, creating shapes that, for a moment, resembled faces or silhouettes. But all it took was a blink, and everything disappeared. And then a different sound began to emerge, almost imperceptible at first. It wasn't the usual cracking of ice nor the whistling of wind. It was a rhythmic, slow sound that seemed to come from below, like muffled beats, distant but regular. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination working against her, but the more she listened, the more real it became. If you're enjoying this atmosphere and want to find out what happens inside this icy hangar, Please like and subscribe to the channel. This will help us continue bringing you captivating, chilling stories that make you feel every detail as if you were actually there. Now let's move on. She stood up slowly, her muscles stiff with cold. She walked to the center of the hangar, trying to pinpoint the exact location of the sound. Each step seemed too loud, and the rhythmic noise grew louder, closer. She felt her heartbeat in time with the sound, as if being pulled by an invisible call. The ground beneath her boots began to vibrate slightly, a tremor almost imperceptible, but enough to make the ice emit small cracks of protest. Her breath became shallow, not just from the cold, but from the anticipation of what might be about to happen. She looked around and noticed something strange. The air inside the hangar seemed denser, almost heavy, and the light that had previously filtered through the cracks seemed to dim, as if something outside were blocking the passage. The sounds became clearer, more urgent, and a shiver ran down her spine. She still didn't know what it was, but she was absolutely certain she wasn't alone in that place. The silence was almost solid, as if it had its own weight, suffocating the air and making every breath a conscious task. No human noise, no voices, no footsteps echoed in the hangar. Only absolute emptiness, broken from time to time by dry, irregular cracks of the ice expanding on the metal structures. The sound wasn't loud, but in that setting, it gained a disturbing force. Each crack was like a reminder that the cold was alive, active, dominating the space. The metal vibrated slightly, as if the ice were testing it, pressing against its boundaries, and with each new, imperceptible crack, the environment seemed more fragile. The absence of human movement made the atmosphere even heavier, as if this place had been deliberately forgotten by the rest of the world, and now she was the only witness to a frozen time. The air, laden with a damp chill, seeped through her clothes, piercing through layers and striking her skin with the precision of invisible blades. The hairs on her arms stood on end, not just from the cold, but from an instinctive sense of alert. It was as if something in that silence was waiting for her, watching, and this awareness became unbearable as the minutes dragged on. The exclusion she felt was not just physical but also emotional. It was the sensation of being deliberately separated, forgotten, as if this punishment were intended to leave her alone until she lost herself within herself. Her mind began to work against her, filling the void with assumptions, distorted memories, and images she didn't want to visualize. The more she tried to concentrate on remaining calm, the more aggressive the silence became, pressing like an invisible weight on her shoulders. With each breath, she became aware of the muffled sound of air rushing in and out of her lungs, and this only reinforced how isolated she felt. The world outside seemed non-existent, and the loneliness took on an almost palpable form. The dim, filtered light coming through the cracks barely illuminated the room, creating elongated shadows that danced almost imperceptibly when a crack of ice echoed. These shadows, projected onto the cold walls, seemed to move too subtly to ignore, yet too quickly to acknowledge. It was as if the silence were creating illusions, distorting the perception of space. Each second there didn't pass. It stretched, multiplied, transforming minutes into eternities. Her body began to react instinctively. Muscles tensed, her breathing shallowed, her eyes scanning the room relentlessly, as if searching for a way out she already knew didn't exist. The feeling of abandonment took a brutal toll on her psyche. It wasn't just being alone, it was knowing no one would come. There was no sound of doors, no approaching footsteps, no voices calling her name. Only that immense emptiness, punctuated by the occasional dry crunch of ice, reminding her that nature continued its course, even when humans gave up. This absence of human presence made her feel diminished, small, almost irrelevant in the face of the vastness of space and the cold that dominated it. And then, just when she thought her body had grown accustomed to the silence perceived only by her senses, her heart raced again upon hearing a closer, clearer crack, as if the ice had shifted just behind her. She didn't immediately dare turn away. She stood still, staring straight ahead, trying to rationalize. It was just the cold. It was just the metal. It was just the structure adapting. But deep down, something inside her insisted it wasn't just that. Vulnerability made everything more intense. Any slight change in the environment seemed a harbinger of something greater, something about to reveal itself. She felt not only observed, but tested by the silence itself, as if she were being challenged to resist that invisible weight to the limit. Perhaps this is precisely what separates those who give in to the cold and those who survive. The ability to bear the weight of a silence that is not just the absence of sound, but the presence of something that refuses to be named. And if you were there, would you endure this kind of silence, or would it tear from you something you never intended to reveal? The sound came at first as a barely perceptible whisper, so distant it could have been mistaken for the natural creak of ice shifting under the invisible pressure of extreme temperatures. But there was something about it that didn't fit the slow, predictable rhythm of the cold. It was irregular, almost like a breath trapped between metal and wind, pulsing unsteadily, echoing between the containers lined up like motionless sentinels. She stopped, not out of immediate fear, but because of the instinctive feeling of a presence breaking the sonic routine of that place. It was as if each pulse echoed not only in the air, but within her, reaching a silent layer of attention that had been dormant until then. The isolation of the hangar, already charged with a heavy loneliness, seemed to expand, making each interval between sounds even more suffocating. Instead of dissipating, the noise gained substance, shaping itself into waves that ebbed and flowed, as if trying to measure the distance to her own consciousness. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to mentally filter out the ordinary sounds, the crack of ice breaking in the distance, the metallic groan of structures under the weight of snow, the icy whisper of wind through cracks. But this sound didn't fit into any of those categories. It was more organic and at the same time more calculated. With each repetition, the interval shortened, as if something were deliberately approaching. The echo seemed to know where she was, and it bothered her. Her steps, until then slow and mechanical, began to hesitate. The outlines of the hangar grew darker, and the shadows cast by the dim lights flickered in time with the sound, as if drawn by it. She tried to rationalize. It could just be a loose piece of metal banging against the exterior wall in the wind. Maybe it was an animal trapped between the containers, seeking shelter. But at the same time, a silent part of her mind screamed that it wasn't random. The cadence, though irregular, seemed to follow an almost deliberate pattern, as if it were a sequence of signals. Suddenly, a louder crack shattered the air, and she realized the echo wasn't just coming from somewhere. It was being reflected. It felt as if the sound was designed to reach specifically that narrow corridor between the containers where she stood. The cold, which until then had been merely physical, began to seep inside, awakening that anxiety that manifests itself not in shivering, but in a sudden stillness. Her senses sharpened, as if her body understood before her mind that something was wrong. She turned slightly, observing the dark depth that stretched between the steel blocks. With each step she took to locate its source, the sound seemed to recede, only to return soon after, more intense, as if guiding her to a specific point. Her heart began to beat with the rhythm of that sonorous pulse, and it deeply disturbed her. It was as if her body were being conditioned, an invisible rhythm dictating the frequency of her breathing. The thin air seemed to carry an extra weight, and each breath was accompanied by a strange tension, as if something were about to reveal itself. She realized the sound wasn't coming from one clear direction, but from several at once, making her spin slowly, as if she were at the center of an invisible circle. The most unsettling detail was when the echo subtly changed tone. It was no longer just a dry, distant rumble. There was a resonance, almost like a voice muffled by distance and ice. The realization was instantaneous, a shiver running down her spine so quickly she nearly lost her balance. If it had been just the wind, the sound would have dispersed. But here it seemed to concentrate, to gain weight, as if carrying an intention. She realized she'd been holding her breath, unconsciously trying to hear that strange frequency better. Her fingers closed around the side of the container, the cold metal burning her skin from the brutal temperature difference. The world around her reduced to two elements, the sound and her reaction to it. With each passing second, the boundary between physical reality and instinctive perception grew more tenuous, and in that instant, a thought pierced her mind with the force of a silent warning. What if that sound wasn't just passing by, but searching? If you were in this hallway, With the echo approaching and no face to associate with its source, what would be the first thing you would do? The sound seemed to dominate the space, as if each crack were a reminder that something was alive beneath that icy surface. At first she tried to ignore it, attributing it to the extreme cold and the ice sheets expanding with the temperature change. But the human body, even when trained to rationalize, instinctively recognizes a pattern, and that was exactly what she was picking up. These weren't random slaps. They came in intervals, almost rhythmically, as if obeying an invisible force. With each new sequence, the air felt heavier. The metal tenser and the ground itself beneath her boots vibrated almost imperceptibly. It was the kind of detail that would go unnoticed by anyone distracted, but not by someone who has learned through experience to recognize subtle signs of danger. The steel walls of the container echoed like a dull drum, multiplying the sound until it was impossible to pinpoint its exact source. The biting cold seeped through the cracks, but now the physical discomfort was secondary. Something deeper was happening. Her eyes roamed every corner, and she noticed small tremors in the chains hanging from supports, swaying almost in time with the creaking. Her hands, though steady, began to sweat inside her gloves, and each breath produced a dense cloud that seemed to dissipate more slowly, as if the air itself were trapping heat and releasing it with resistance. The wind outside changed direction in short bursts, but strangely the sound inside didn't match. This meant only one thing: what she heard wasn't coming from outside. It was internal, a growing pressure, almost as if something were settling behind the walls or under the floor. Instinct screamed that this wasn't normal. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to mentally map the rhythm of the sounds, like counting the seconds between thunder and lightning. It wasn't a perfect rhythm, but there were repetitions. Short bursts, then a break, and then the same set of cracks again. This was behavior, not chance. The tension wasn't just in the room, it was in her. Her mind worked quickly, evaluating hypotheses. It could be ice cracking from within, but for the sound to repeat with such cadence, there would have to be a constant source of pressure. And what could exert pressure inside a block of solid ice, if not something trying to escape? The temperature, even freezing, didn't seem enough to explain the phenomenon. It was as if a weight were being slowly pushed, millimeter by millimeter, testing the limits of the structure. The metal, in turn, responded with dry cracks, like a warning before giving way. She also began to feel a subtle vibration beneath her boots, different from that which came from gusts of wind or the natural movement of the ice. This vibration traveled up her legs and settled in her stomach, creating an uneasy sensation, like a physical premonition. Her body reacted in ways her mind was still trying to rationalize. Cold sweat trickled down the back of her neck, and the air seemed denser, requiring more effort to breathe. It was as if the atmosphere inside had become complicit in something that was about to happen. She tried to move closer to one of the walls to listen better, pressing her ear against the icy metal. The cold surface burned her skin, but she held her position. It was then that she realized there was a muffled sound, like a slow shifting of mass, something heavy moving. It wasn't rapid or sudden, but constant, insistent. Each crack now seemed to be the metal and ice's response to this force. It was as if she were listening to a silent conversation between structures, each resisting to its limit. She took a step back, but couldn't take her eyes off the wall in front of her. The pattern was faster now, as if whatever was pressing down from within had sensed the resistance was waning. Tension grew not just in the steel and ice, but within her. Her muscles were rigid, her heart was racing, and all her senses were focused on that single point. Every fraction of a second seemed longer, and the weight became unbearable. It was impossible not to feel part of something larger and more dangerous, as if witnessing the prologue to an event that, once begun, would never be reversed. With each crack, her entire body seemed to be telling her to run, but there was also the strange sensation of staying and seeing what would happen. And would you, in her place, trust your instinct to flee or stay to discover what was truly pressing against the walls from within? The silence was deep, piercing, like a blanket of ice covering everything around her. The sense of isolation was palpable. Each second felt like an eternity, and as the biting wind squeezing through the cracks in the containers, she felt as if the environment itself were trying to swallow her. The cold wasn't just physical. It was a constant presence, a pressure on her shoulders, as if the world were about to collapse around her. The sound of wind against metal reverberated, but still, the stillness was absolute. Then, without warning, a metallic crack echoed through the floor, shattering the stillness of the room. It was a sound no one should hear. The chain, once secure, now snapped with a silent but destructive force. The crack that followed was even more ominous. It seemed to come from beneath the frozen floor, as if something were pressing against the very foundations of the place. The air around her seemed to have distorted, rippling with tension. She stopped, her heart racing, and a chill ran down her spine. It wasn't the wind, nor the ice. It was something deeper, more dangerous. Something was moving beneath, something she didn't want to face. The cracking continued, louder now, more frequent. The sound was metallic and distant, as if an invisible force were trying to release something long held there. With each crack, the ground seemed to tremble slightly, as if the weight of a large structure were about to collapse. Each new noise seemed to heighten the feeling that there was no longer any safety anywhere. The tension was palpable. She knew she couldn't stay there, but she didn't know what awaited her beyond the door. Each step she took felt more perilous, as if the ground might give way beneath her feet at any moment. But the worst was what she felt in her skin, in her gut. Danger was imminent. It wasn't just the sound. It was the vibration of the air around her, the way everything around her seemed to be compressing. Something wasn't right, and she knew it. It was a sense of foreboding, as if the environment itself was against her, as if the place were full of invisible threats, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. She looked around, trying to find an explanation, but everything was dark, the dim light illuminating just enough for her to see the details that made the environment even more oppressive. Shadows danced on the walls, as if the darkness itself were alive, waiting to devour her. The cold was no longer just a physical phenomenon, but a presence, something that touched her soul. With each crack, she felt her body react, as if she were being pulled into something much larger and more dangerous than anything she could comprehend at that moment. The sound intensified, the clang of metal now mingling with a new noise, muffled, deeper. It was as if something large was stirring in the depths, something that should not be awakened. She felt a chill creep up the back of her neck. The tension was unbearable, as if she were being watched by invisible eyes, waiting for her to make a mistake. Each breath seemed more labored, as if the air were becoming denser, heavier. The sense of impending doom enveloped her, and she knew with terrifying certainty that she was about to be confronted with something beyond her control. The broken chain wasn't just a warning. It was the key to something much greater, something she couldn't comprehend. The pressure was building, and she felt her heartbeat synchronize with the cracks, as if the environment itself were part of a macabre orchestra preparing for the great rupture. Danger was imminent, and she had no way of knowing where it would come from. The cracking sound kept coming, like a hammer pounding on the door of her sanity, and she felt time tightening around her, as if something were about to burst. She moved slowly, as if the mere act of moving could hasten the arrival of disaster. Every sound seemed a prelude to something greater, something more sinister. The sound of breaking metal, the creak of the floor shifting, were the nails in the coffin of a reality that was rapidly turning into a nightmare. There was no escape. The environment was closing in on her, and the shadows that had once seemed merely reflections of the cold were now becoming something more. She knew what was coming wouldn't be simple. It wouldn't be just the sound of ice expanding or metal creaking. What lay behind that sound was the true threat. Danger, she sensed, was approaching, and there was no longer any way to ignore it. The silence had been broken, and now with each new crack, fear gripped her even more. The danger was there, right beneath her feet, and she didn't know if she would have time to react. She had no choice. She could only move forward, even though she knew each step took her deeper into the darkness. The sound was now a warning, a call to the abyss. She felt the weight of the world on her shoulders, and terror mixed with a sense of helplessness. Whatever was about to happen, she could not stop it. She felt the air compress even more, and with a final crack, the atmosphere seemed to swallow any vestige of safety that remained. In the end, she didn't know if danger was coming for her or if she was approaching it. Whatever it was, she was about to find out, and that was something no one should ever experience. The biting cold seeped through every crack, but it wasn't the cold that weighed most heavily on her mind. What paralyzed her was the clear, almost sensory memory of the hushed conversations she'd overheard months earlier between two veteran technicians. They hadn't known she was nearby, stacking boxes at the end of the hallway, when they began speaking in that grave, almost superstitious tone. They were discussing a warning that wasn't included in official communiques or written protocols, but that everyone who had spent enough time at the base knew, a specific, impossible-to-mistake sound that preceded the breaking of the ice. It wasn't the simple cracking caused by cold or wind, but something deeper, with an irregular cadence that seemed to rise from the depths of the frozen earth. A sound that, when heard, left even the most seasoned man utterly silent. That day, one of them even said he'd rather face a 3-day storm without shelter than hear that noise again. It wasn't an exaggeration. The sound meant only one thing: lethal danger. As the memory played out vividly before her eyes, she felt the invisible pressure of that echo that was no longer just a memory. The metal floor seemed to vibrate beneath her boots, as if something were down there, forcing its way through. Her breath became shallower, and her body instinctively assumed the posture of someone preparing to run, though there was nowhere to go. The technician's report came back to her in every detail, the deep, almost metallic timbre that sounded like chains scraping against rock, followed by a hollow crack that never repeated the same way twice, as if the ice itself were warning her that its structure would not last long. They had said that anyone who has heard that sound up close never forgets it, and that once it starts, it's too late to think about calmly evacuating. Now the echo seemed to ripple through the hangar, reverberating between the walls, and creating the sensation of coming from all sides at once. She didn't need to see anything to know it was no ordinary noise. Stories of tragic accidents, whispered on silent winter nights, mingled in that moment, fueling the certainty that every second counted. She felt a chill run down the back of her neck, not from the cold, but from the ancestral instinct that screams when danger is real. She knew that if she drew attention, she could generate panic, and if she remained silent, she risked being caught off guard along with everyone else. The fine line between acting and freezing in place seemed thinner than ever. As the sound grew louder, she wondered if she was only listening with her ears, or if that vibration was already reaching her own ribcage, as if the warning wanted to imprint itself not only on her mind, but also on her body. And it's in these kinds of moments that people reveal what they're made of. Some try to rationalize, others move before even understanding. And you, if you were in her place, would you wait another second or act now? The sound of her own heart seemed to beat louder than anything around. The biting cold seeped through her clothes, but it wasn't the cold that paralyzed her hands. It was the urgency, the growing fear, the awareness that every second lost could cost her dearly. Without a radio, without a phone, without any means of communication other than her own voice and physical strength, she began pounding against the metal sheets of the hangar with all the intensity her arms could carry. The noise echoed, but it wasn't an echo that carried the message. It was a treacherous echo, sending the sound back to her, multiplied as if mocking her efforts. The wind, sharp and constant, entered through the cracks and dragged the sound waves away, dissolving her scream in the white immensity. She ran down the narrow corridor lined with stacked shipping containers, each step making the ground tremble slightly under the weight of her boots. She screamed again, but the sensation was like throwing stones into a frozen lake. The impact was dull, and nothing moved. The cold air burned her lungs, and her breath came in quick puffs that quickly dissipated in the glacial atmosphere. There was a constant, low, distant sound that mingled with the wind itself, making her wonder if anyone could actually distinguish her voice from that sonic chaos. Each attempt to make herself heard seemed more futile than the last, but stopping was not an option. Her fingers throbbed, not only from the cold, but from the frantic repetition of pounding on the metal structures. She pounded on the walls with any object she could find, iron bars, tools left on a bench, even her own boots, trying to produce a noise that stood out from the surroundings, something that would attract attention. The metal responded with a dry, muffled sound that seemed to die away a few meters away. There was no sign of anyone hearing. The immense space of the hangar, empty and cavernous, acted like an acoustic prison, trapping her despair within its icy walls. Sweat began to break out on her forehead, contrasting with the biting cold. It was a strange sensation. Her body was warmed by adrenaline, but the environment insisted on stealing every bit of heat. She stared at the closed doors, wondering if anyone on the other side was close enough to notice something was wrong. She decided to run from one side to the other, alternating screams with knocks, trying to create a sound pattern that would be impossible to ignore. For a moment, she thought she heard a different noise, as if something had responded, but then the wind swallowed everything again. Her breathing was already heavy, her lungs burning, and the constant echo of her own footsteps mingled with the whistling of the wind. The metal walls, previously merely cold, now seemed to lean in on her, as if the space shrank with each failed attempt to communicate. It was like being trapped in a dream where you scream and no one hears, and reality cruelly offered no chance of waking. The silence imposed by the ice wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a living blockade, an invisible wall that reflected everything back in distorted form. She tried to remember every access route to the hangar, wondering where someone might be closest. She ran to the large cargo door, kicking it hard, but the noise faded into the frozen air. She turned back, climbed a stack of crates to try to reach a higher point, and screamed again, stretching her body as if a few inches could make a difference. The sound spread into the void, but brought no response. With each passing second, the certainty that she was alone grew more solid, and with it the urgency grew like a pressure inside her chest. She knew something was happening, something that demanded the others know immediately. But the hangar was unforgiving, a gigantic space dominated by air currents that carried any noise in unpredictable directions. The cold metal returned dull echoes, and the wind outside created a constant roar, as if nature itself wanted to prevent communication. Her body was already showing signs of exhaustion, but her mind screamed to keep going. It was a race against time, and stopping was the only guarantee of failure. And it is at this moment that the inevitable question arises. Have you ever felt that helplessness of trying to warn someone about something urgent and realizing that no one is listening? The steam escaped like a sigh from the bowels of the earth, but it was no ordinary sigh. It was hot, dense, and carried a metallic scent that seeped into the frigid air, contrasting with the sharp breath of winter that had previously dominated the hangar and its surroundings. Among the containers stacked like sleeping giants, she realized that the cracks in the ice were not simple fissures caused by the temperature change. No, they formed in an organized, almost symmetrical fashion, as if something down there had the strength and purpose to force its way to the surface. Each dry crack that echoed sounded like a warning, like the prelude to something that refused to be contained. She approached with measured steps, feeling the floor vibrate beneath her boots, and with every meter she advanced, the steam increased, making the air heavier, making her breath ragged. The beams of light that entered through the cracks in the ceiling illuminated the dense whiteness rising from the ground, creating a scene that seemed more like a fever dream than reality. Her eyes searched for the exact point of origin, and then she saw it. The ice was deforming, forming concentric circles, and in the center of them, a small but slowly expanding hole, spewing more steam, like the final gasp of a beast before awakening. The sound was no longer just that of ice cracking. There was a muffled, distant roar coming from the depths, a low frequency she felt in her chest, as if the very air itself were vibrating within her. Instinct told her to retreat, but something in the back of her mind, fueled by curiosity and perhaps a strange sense of importance, urged her to get closer, to be the first to see whatever was about to emerge. In her peripheral field of vision, the metal walls of the containers seemed to sweat, small drops of condensation dripping, and it made no sense. The temperature there had been freezing seconds before. A quick, unsettling thought crossed her mind. What if this wasn't natural? What if it wasn't a climatic phenomenon, but rather a reaction to something that had been done inside or left behind? The air was charged with electricity, as before a storm, and her goosebumps confirmed that something invisible was touching her. She felt she wasn't alone, even without hearing footsteps or voices. The source of that heat seemed to have a life of its own, a presence that watched silently, waiting for the right moment. It was no longer just a physical discovery. There was something almost spiritual or profane in this meeting of ice and hidden fire. And the instant a new fissure opened, releasing a stronger jet of steam, the ground shook with enough intensity to make one of the containers shudder and emit a deep, metallic groan. Her breathing quickened, and even without understanding why, her heart pounded, as if she were about to witness something that would change everything. Now the question that kept running through her mind was whether to call the others or keep this secret until she understood. But would she have time to decide? The echo of the sound still reverberated in her bones when the first silhouettes appeared in the icy mist. The biting wind pushed snowflakes into her eyes, but she could make out tense faces, quickened footsteps, and urgent gestures. The feeling that something was wrong was no longer a whisper in the back of her mind. It was now a deafening scream that filled the entire room. As they approached, one of the men's eyes met hers, and in that instant, the truth began to form in fragments, like pieces of a puzzle revealing a disturbing image. They didn't seem surprised by the cracks in the ice. They weren't just looking at the fissures multiplying beneath their feet. They were looking down much deeper, as if they knew something was there that shouldn't be. She then realized that the ice wasn't just breaking from pressure or abnormal heat rising from the depths. The sound was irregular, pulsating, almost like muffled breathing. The cracking was just the surface of a much larger and more alive phenomenon. With each new crack, it wasn't just the structure that crumbled. It was as if something was trying to force its way out. Men began to spread out, speaking softly but with urgent voices. A woman among them carried a device that looked like a portable sonar, and the display showed waves not static but in continuous motion, as if capturing signals from an organism. The air seemed denser, heavier, and a subtle vibration ran through the ground, rising through her boots and reaching her chest, racing the heartbeat of anyone standing there. She tried to ask what was happening, but one of the men raised his hand, signaling absolute silence. The sound she'd thought was ice-breaking had now become a deep growl, muffled by the layer of ice and water. A sound that shouldn't exist in this desolate region. Something down there was reacting to their presence as if aware it had been discovered. One of them, older, approached and murmured almost inaudibly, "Don't stare for too long, and don't make any sudden movements. He can feel it." The sentence fell like a weight impossible to ignore. She tried to find some logic, but every second reinforced the idea that they were dealing with no simple natural threat. The extreme cold now mixed with a strange heat rising from the ground, a contrast that made the air unstable, almost palpable. Small jets of steam escaped from the cracks, bringing with them a metallic, acrid smell that irritated the throat. It was the kind of odor that seemed to warn of life where there should be none. The group began laying cables and attaching hooks to ice floes, not to contain the break, but to monitor it. She noticed the expressions on their faces weren't those of someone planning a rescue, but of someone preparing to witness something that could change everything. With each new sound, the tension grew. It wasn't the predictable crack of an ice sheet giving way. It was a pattern. 3 long beats, a pause, 2 short ones, as if it were a rudimentary communication, as if something deep down was responding. Then, without warning, one of the cracks widened with a dull boom. The pressure caused the snow to jump, and the vibration threw some off balance. One of the cables snapped and whipped through the air, nearly hitting one of the men. From within the opening, a jet of hot, dark water rose, reaching more than 2 meters before falling and freezing in the wind. The silence that followed was even more unsettling. It was as if everyone there was waiting for the next move of that invisible something. She felt, deep in her stomach, that the break was only the beginning, that what was to come would not only threaten the ice, but everything on it. Now it was no longer a matter of repairing the damage. It was about surviving what was about to emerge. And in that moment, she realized that perhaps her biggest mistake had been not listening to the early signs. Have you ever felt like something terrible was about to happen, but no one around you believed it? The wind cut like invisible blades, carrying with it the feeling that time was running out. The base shuddered beneath everyone's feet, each crack in the ice sounding like a sentence. Chaos spread, boots running, voices shouting orders, the air saturated with fear. But amidst all the urgency, she stopped. Something inside her told her to look one last time. She turned slowly, her heart beating like a drum, and it was at that moment that she saw, through a small crack in the ice, almost hidden by the cold mist, a quick, precise movement, as if calculated to catch her attention. It was no ordinary shadow. It wasn't someone's reflection. It had presence, it had intention. And then, in a moment that seemed to last an eternity, she realized it wasn't she who was watching. It was she who was being watched. 2 points of light, cold and deep, stared back at her. There was no expression, but there was a silent message, something that needed no words to be understood. It was a gaze that pierced the flesh and reached the soul, as if probing every memory, every secret, every fear. A gaze that seemed to know not only the present, but everything that was yet to come. The sound of ice giving way grew louder, a dull pressure filling her ears, and for a brief second she felt that if she didn't move, if she didn't breathe, this moment might last longer. But then the fissure opened abruptly, the surface trembled, and part of the ground collapsed, swallowing everything in a roar that mixed water, air, and the distant echo of something that sounded like a call. That look disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, but the feeling remained. She knew that from then on nothing would be the same. It wasn't just the foundation that had been shattered, but also the thin line separating what was seen from what was ignored, what was real from what was denied. Whatever it was, it didn't just stare at her. It marked her. And deep down she understood that while everyone else thought they had escaped an accident, she had been chosen for something much greater, something she couldn't yet understand but felt was inevitable. There was fear, yes, but along with it a spark of inexplicable faith, a certainty that even in the face of the unknown, there was purpose. And as the ice closed in again beneath the dark waters, she walked out with a weight on her chest and a silent promise on her lips. When the moment came, she would be ready. If this story touched you, please like and subscribe to follow every detail of the upcoming revelations. In the next video, you'll discover what was really behind that look, and why it could change everything you think you know about what lies beneath the ice.